I don't think in any constitutional democracy in the world this has happened. In the famous Miller case in the UK, Boris Johnson tried to bypass Parliament and requested the Queen to prorogue the House. The House was prorogued. Immediately, matter came to the Supreme Court. All the justices of the court said, "No, Your Lordship knows this is the executive power of the government. They can prorogue the House." But all came to a unanimous decision. You cannot even prorogue the House like this. You cannot exercise executive power to bypass Parliament. You bypass discussion in Parliament. That's not the way constitutional democracies work. And this is much worse. You assume something that doesn't exist. You give powers to the governor which he does not have. You assume to yourself under 356 all the powers of the state legislature. You are Parliament, so you therefore invoke the powers of the state legislature and Parliament, and you pass an executive order. What kind of exercise of law is that, or constitutional law? And then D, in the proviso to clause 3 of Article 370 of this Constitution, the expression Constituent Assembly of the state referred to in clause 2 shall read the Legislative Assembly of the state. What power does the President have to pass such an order? We're not dealing here with exercise of constitutional power. We're dealing with exercise of executive power.
Just as a test, from their perspective, why was the amendment to 367 necessary at all? Why was this crucial? I mean, we are seeing now the modalities which they have put into place for their constitutional design of ultimately abrogating 370. Why was this amendment to 367 necessary?
Because, they themselves gave the power of the Legislative Assembly, which they were exercising in 356 as the Constituent Assembly, and recommending. They were ad item with my interpretation.
Yes.
They were ad item with my interpretation.
Right.
That you needed the recommendation of the Constituent Assembly. So how do you reach there?
They constituted the Legislative Assembly as the Constituent Assembly.
And what they do is they don't interpret it. They say in proviso 3 of 370, the expression Constituent Assembly of the state referred to in clause 3 shall read as Legislative Assembly. So they have amended Article 370 of the Constitution.
Actually,
Shall read as
367 amendment was not required because you exercise power under clause 1 to say article.
No, it was required because you needed the recommendation of the Constituent Assembly.
No, that's something separate. But in 367, introducing clause 4, in terms of the notification dated 5th August 2019.
You required it because they changed the definition of Constituent Assembly in 370 as Legislative Assembly. This is why they could exercise power under 356. Please appreciate.
But suppose for a moment that they had not gone through this exercise of amending 367, all right, or introducing 367(4), and suppose we are operating purely within the fold of 356.
Yes.
All right, your challenge to the 356 notification is a different issue.
Yes.
And now just testing it as an exercise of power under 356. Once a proclamation takes place under 356, two consequences follow. One, the President assumes to herself all the powers of the state, the executive powers of the state vest in the President. Two, except the legislature, the powers of the state legislature. Two, the powers of the state legislature are then subsumed in Parliament. The government of India does not in its executive capacity exercise the powers of the state legislature. Parliament has to exercise the powers. So once the proclamation under 356 was issued, two consequences would follow. All the powers which were vested in the executive of Jammu and Kashmir were transferred to the President.
Right.
All the powers of the state legislature were vested in Parliament.
Right.
Now, if that was so, then if 370(3) is capable of the interpretation, just as a hypothesis, that it's a power to be exercised by the President to abrogate. They abrogate Point number 2, any powers which were to be exercised by the state legislature would have to be exercised by parliament. So they had to go to parliament to get a resolution passed. Why was 367 necessary for the design, for the constitutional design to achieve this at all?
I tell you, 356 power cannot be exercised by parliament, by the governor, by the president and parliament in this fashion. Independent of 367, cannot be done.
Why?
Because you are only acting as the legislature. You don't have any powers independent of the legislature under 356. That's, Gavai has held that. You have no such powers. And the executive is only dealing with administration. It can't amend the constitution under 356. Therefore, they had to do this. There was no choice. I'll show Gavai.
Yes. But assuming for a moment that we suppose we disregard the 367 amendment.
Even if you do, then you can't exercise it under 356 at all. It's even, it will be a dead letter. It will be inchoate. Because you can't amend constitutional provisions, through 356. You can only exercise the power of the state. Parliament can do it.
Fair enough. Therefore, if that part of the notification, which amends 367, is kept aside for a moment, then what is the consequence?
The consequence is that 356 power cannot be exercised in the same fashion.
No.
To achieve the same result.
See, the 356 power is the power of the state legislature and the state executive, which has now been vested in the president and in parliament, respectively.
Correct.
You may be right for a moment, subject to hearing them, that look, how can you exercise the power to amend the constitution by taking recourse to 356? Fair enough. We got that point and we'll hear them on that. But assume that we disregard this whole process of what took place under 367. Either disregard it or hold that it was constitutionally impermissible. Even so, does it affect?
That's a separate issue, Malad. I'll address your lordships on that.
Right.
At the moment, I'm on this executive order. I'll come to 356. I'll come to the other issues later, Malad. Because ultimately, what you then do is Parliament is exercising power as a legislature, and Parliament is exercising powers under 356 as well. Correct, Malad? And as a legislature of the state, let's assume, the state had to convert itself into a constituent assembly in terms of 373.
I think what they believed was they proceeded on a particular hypothesis that consultation with the constituent assembly is necessary.
That's right.
So therefore, they said that, all right, we are now going to replace the word constituent assembly by the word legislative assembly. Which they sought to achieve by amending the constitution.
No, it's the recommendation of the constituent. It's not just converting it. You can't.
The first step was to amend the constitution.
Yeah, you recommend it to yourself because you have a political objective to recommend it, and Mullahs, you take the decision yourself.
Yes.
These are very problematic, Mullahs. And see the consequences of this. That means through an executive order, you can change any provision of the constitution because you have majority. But this majoritarian culture cannot destroy the edifice of what our forefathers gave us.
So your argument, therefore, is that you cannot exercise the power under 356 to amend the constitution.
Exactly.
That point you...
That's right. And they cannot possibly justify it unless there is some new jurisprudence that comes to light that they can do what they like as long as they have the majority. As it is, Mullahs, now one of your esteemed colleagues has said, Mullahs, that in fact basic structure, those theories are also doubtful. Maybe
Mr.
it is.
Sibal, when we refer to a colleague, we have to refer to a sitting colleague. Once we cease to be judges, they are opinions, not binding diktats.
That's true. Of course, it's not binding, Mullahs, but I'm surprised.
On 11th of November 19...
Parliament doesn't discuss what goes on in the court.
No, I'm not discussing anything.
I am not discuss what goes on in Parliament.
No, I'm not discussing.
Everyone, my lord, has a freedom
This is a public
view, freedom of expression.
No, I know. Mullahs, I assume he has the freedom of expression, what he likes. I don't dispute that, Mullahs. I'm just saying, Mullahs. Of course, absolutely. We're starting a debate on that because of this majoritarian culture again.